Hello and welcome back to my channel. About 5 years ago or something, I made a video about girls sitting down. I didn't really think much about it, but apparently the internet loved it. I want to make something a lot better for you. So I've come back and I'm redoing that video from the ground up, and we're going to see if we can make it way better. So the first thing that I'm drawing here is a girl sitting down on her knees, and we've got a sort of top-down view. So to help me with these kinds of poses, I create a sort of like bounding box, and then all of the character stays within that bounding box. That means that I only have to make sure that the perspective is correct on the bounding box, and I know that everything inside is going to match. You can see where I'm doing this, where I'm creating these parallel lines that all line up, so I know that they're all in the correct perspective. Now let's take a look at that same pose but from a different angle. We've got more of a side-on view angle this time. I'm not using a bounding box with this one, instead I'm just using the circle, triangle, circle technique that I showed in my original video. If you didn't see the first video, the idea was that there is just a circle for the head, a triangle for the main torso area, and then another circle for about from the hips down, and that worked as a framework for the base model of the character. One thing that I've added to this technique to kind of add more volume to the character is by making these simplified structures underneath that mimic the structures of the body. For example, you'll notice that I've used this rounded form to emulate the lungs or the rib cage of the character, and that's created this sort of bump on the outside of the silhouette of the character because she's sitting so upright. So instead of just relying on that base triangle and circle, now I'm adding in other shapes that match structures such as bones or muscle groups that can indicate overall movements or highlight little areas of the body, sort of like landmarks that we look for that remind us that this is a real human being. So here we've got another character sat on the floor, and we've got the circle, triangle, circle as the base, and then I've got a line of action indicating the front of the character. I find this really helpful because not only does it help me to orientate the character, but I can indicate where the movement is happening or the line of action is happening in the character. Once I have this established, I can let the rest of the body parts kind of react to that, whether it's by adding an additional movement, like a follow-through movement, or if it's like in this image where I'm letting the arms kind of relax and fall on top of the rest of the form, in turn exaggerating the movement that the rest of the body is doing. So here we're doing a front-facing cross-legged pose. Again, I start with my basic circle, triangle, circle, but then because I've got quite a complicated leg setup, I'm using these basic arches to indicate where I want the legs to be and how I want them to overlap. One thing that I think shows in this pose the most is that I think it's very beneficial for you to try out the poses that you're trying to get your character to do, to see what they feel like and see if they are possible. I used to always draw cross-legged poses where the knees were essentially touching the floor, which, if I think back to my ballet days when I was about 6, I remember hating that. So now what I'm trying to do is make sure that those knees are up and raised so that the character looks more relaxed and more comfortable. So with this next pose, it's not really as based in reality as the previous one. This one's more illustrative and is the kind of thing you might use for an anime illustration or for an anime figurine. So again, I'm thinking about how much of this is based in realism and what I want to do with the character, and how much of it is more of an artistic choice or something more fashionable. One thing that I'm focusing a lot on this pose, and also in the others, is by having very carefully chosen simplified shapes on the arms and legs that indicate the underlying forms. I've learnt this through studying realism and learning the correct structures of the anatomy, but then I've translated it by simplifying it down into some very basic indicators of what these forms are, so that it can work for a much more simplified art style such as these little dolls. Okay, for this next one I'm using another top-down view, which means I'm really thinking about that perspective. I could use a bounding box here, but another thing that could have been useful was to create a ground plane. There's two main ways to do that. One is to create a sort of grid that your character sits on, and that can be helpful for plotting things out. Or if you don't feel comfortable designing a grid with the perspective lines, you could just draw a shadow of the character of essentially what parts of them need to touch the floor. The greatest thing about doing this is that it ensures that your character is actually sitting on the plane of the floor and that they aren't clipping into other objects around them. Again, you can see throughout this that I've used these parallel lines all the way through the character to make sure that everything that should line up does line up. Okay, so one thing I want you to pay attention in particular with this piece is how much I'm drawing through the form. So that's when you draw shapes such as circles or contour lines that you can't actually see on the surface, and it's almost like you're drawing the inside of the shape. So you can see this on the leg where I've drawn some circles at the widest part of the leg and also at the ankle. You can also see it where I've drawn forms for the rib cage and for the knee. If you try to draw without using this technique, you can end up with quite 2D or flat characters. But by drawing through the form, you almost trick yourself into believing fully that it is a 3D character. And by filling it with all of that information that tricks the viewer into believing the 3D form of it, you're adding depth and you're adding a lot of movement from shapes that you otherwise wouldn't normally think of. For this next piece, we've got a person who is sat with their legs sort of crossed, but it's more of an illustrative piece than a piece based in realism. They're kicking their leg forward, and this would work well for maybe like a manga page or a sort of like anime poster. Less so, more that than a more figurative piece. Whether you want to do a piece that's based in realism or if you want to completely stylize it and create your own physics, both of those decisions are valid, but make sure that it's a decision you're choosing to make. If you want a character that really feels real, you have to learn realism to inform your art. In this next pose, we've got these sort of bowed legs. This is something I wanted to mention as it can tell a lot about the actual character or the plot of your story. When you're designing your character or their pose, think about how the pose communicates their character and their personality. By adding these bowed legs, I create a character that seems maybe embarrassed or very relaxed or quite friendly. It creates a sort of very kind or gentle personality. But I don't think this would work for a character that I was trying to show off strength with. Maybe I had a warrior character. I would want them to feel a lot stronger and stand with real purpose, whereas this feels a lot more airy-fairy in the way it's moving. So really think about that. Who is your character, and does their pose fit what you want the audience to think about them? In this next piece, we have another sitting on a wall kind of idea, but the character is kind of swinging their legs, very relaxed. I think this would look fantastic if you had an illustration with, say, a swimming pool and they were dipping their legs in it. That would look really cute. Something I tried to focus on a lot with this piece was what parts of the body did I want to show off. So I created this sort of arch in the back, which kind of adds like a cute atmosphere to the character. And I've also thought about the fact that I don't need to show all of both legs to describe what they're doing. I'm letting the viewer just guess what the other leg is doing. They don't have to see all of it. This next pose has a character that is either leaning on something or about to stand up. So the biggest thing I needed to think about here was weight. So where is the weight being distributed, and therefore how does the character's anatomy respond to that? So you can see that I've used these really strong straight lines for the arms and then tense the shoulders to show that she's pushing all of her weight up through her hands, through her arms and into her shoulders. But then I've let the legs seem a lot more relaxed because they aren't holding her weight yet. It tells the audience that the weight is going to move from the arms to the legs. Here's a really fun pose. I like this one. This is probably the pose that I sit in the most during the day. So we've got a character kind of mostly upright, sitting down with one leg tucked underneath. So again, I've used the little arch technique that I used with the crossed legs to draw in that tucked leg. But with the main form, I want a really strong arc to show the movement. So right from the top of the head all the way through the body, down to the tip of the toes, we have this crescent moon shape. And I think I could have made this even stronger by using some references to make the upper torso area more realistic. But I think you get the idea here. We've got this overarching movement that creates a really strong shape language. And when we combine that with this line that cuts through the middle of this tucked under leg, it creates a really interesting character, and you kind of want to learn a little bit more about them. This next pose is a redraw of possibly my favourite pose from the original video, which was this one of her kind of reaching up with her knees tucked in. Really cute pose, but how I've tried to improve it this time is by stretching that arm out as far as possible, in really pushing that shape language and that movement. And then to mimic it, I've used this triangle bounding box for where the legs are going to be. This final pose is a front-on facing view of a very relaxed crossed legs. This is much more natural than some of the other crossed leg poses earlier on. This can be quite a complicated pose. There's a lot of different things that are overlapping with each other, and I'm also thinking about the perspective. So where is the audience? Where is the cameraman? And how does that affect what we can see? Something that can really help with poses like this is to use reference. I didn't have a reference for most of the pieces I used here, but I do think that they would have improved a lot if I had used reference. So you can either find references online, or you could take a reference of yourself. I often take photos of myself in the poses so that I know what the character looks like, and then you can use that to figure out what areas should overlap and what you're going to exaggerate or simplify. So that's all of the poses for today. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope that this video helps you a lot and that it's a lot more informative than the original video. If you have any requests for what you'd like me to do next, please drop them down in the comments section. If you like this kind of video, press like. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more, and I will see you in the next one. Bye bye!